So we're delighted to be interviewing the Global Advocacy and Influencing Director for a major British Christian NGO, Tearfund. And as she describes herself, having a vision to inspire and equip Christianity with a whole life response to poverty, social justice and the environment. Ruth Valerio is known and respected not only for her writings about social justice, the environment and simple living, but also her determination to put her beliefs into practice in her own family. So welcome, Ruth, and thank you for letting us interview you.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're able to interview you remotely because of this wonderful advance in technology via Zoom. So I'm at my home in Sutton in South London. And I was wondering whether you'd be joining us from Chichester, West Sussex, or your Tearfund office in Teddington. I'm guessing you're not, that's not the Tearfund kitchen behind me.
No, you're right. Yep, so joining you from down on the south coast from my kitchen table, which is where I have sat now for many a month, speaking to all sorts of people in the UK and further afield as well.
Yeah, Chichester is a special place on the map for many things spiritual. I was just away in Hull last weekend, seeing friends I hadn't seen for 15 years who are feeling drawn to relocate to Chichester of all. So I said, it's all happening in Chichester again.
It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I have to remind myself that this is somewhere that people come to on holiday. And here I am. I've been swimming in the sea the last few evenings, and we have the South Downs to the north. It's very beautiful.
Beautiful, isn't it? Now, is it, I always get confused between West and East Sussex. Is it East?
West Sussex, West. Yeah.
Fantastic, beautiful. So, as this is an interview in an oral history format, we spend quite a lot of time looking at the geography of home and family life. So, can I ask firstly when and where you were born, Ruth?
Yeah, so I was born in Harlow in Essex. Are you wanting my date of birth?
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you.
Not a problem. 27th of February 1972. So if you take out the 19, I've got a palindromic birth number, which I was always very proud of. And I'll leave you to work that out. So I was born there and was brought up just across the border from Essex in Hertfordshire. My parents were lecturers at a missionary training Bible college called All Nations Christian College, and we lived in the village just near the college there.
Oh, wow. Now, having a palindromic date of birth, was that something your parents were excited about before you were born? Was it like your due date?
No, it wasn't. My due date was a bit later, but it was something I was, and you can tell I still am, very proud of it.
Fantastic. So we'll start a little bit with your family background, and in these interviews we usually start with grandparents. Could you tell us a bit about your grandparents? Anything that comes to mind that you recall about them?
Yeah, my father's parents, his dad died when his mum was pregnant with him, so I never met him and my dad never met him, so that was always and actually strangely, I don't remember how he died. But that was always a sort of shadow over that side. So my dad grew up not knowing his father, but with two older brothers. They were from a fairly wealthy Jewish background. So his mum and then his grandparents, so my great-grandparents, I don't know much detail, but I've always grown up under the impression they were quite wealthy. So when my dad would go and visit his grandparents, they had servants. It was all very upstairs, downstairs. They had servants who, in the evening, at the early evening, they would run a bath for him and put his clothes out on the bed for him to change for dinner, for the formal dinner in the evening. And my grandmother, my dad has told stories of if someone came to visit her, the maid had a silver calling plate. So whoever was coming to visit had a calling card, would put it on there, and then the maid would go and see his mother and say, you know, Mrs. So-and-so has called, and if my grandmother didn't want to see her, then the maid would go back and say, "Oh, I'm very sorry, Mrs. Goldsmith is not at home today." so those are the sort of the stories that I've grown up with. There's lots more I can tell you.
No, tell us. It's fascinating.
Side of the family, when my dad was little, so they're Jewish. They have a Jewish background. They are Jewish. A lot of the family lived in Germany, but their immediate family, the grandparents had, I think, I'm not quite sure which were the grandparents or great-grandparents or who had come over from Germany and established themselves in the UK. But quite a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins were still in Germany. And actually, just to go back a little bit further, one of either possibly great-grandfather set up the London Metal Exchange. So if you go to the London Metal Exchange, there's a plaque to, I think it's my great-grandfather. So my surname is Goldsmith because they were goldsmiths and they established the London Metal Exchange. But during the war, as it looked like Hitler was coming closer to the UK, to England, and coming through France, a wealthy friend of my grandmother's offered to pay for her to take her 3 boys to Bermuda to get out of England in case Hitler did invade, as it was looking like he was going to, and nearly did, as we know. So my dad spent part of his childhood during the war brought up in Bermuda, and then they came back once the war had finished. So that's my dad's grandparents' side.
First time I've heard that, or had to consider that, the idea that the Jewish people in the UK might have had some apprehension in the Second World War.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's obvious, it's blindingly obvious.
Yeah, it is obvious once you come to think about it, isn't it? Yes. And so there's various Holocaust-related stories within my family and family members who didn't get out. And then on my mother's side, my mum is from a long tradition of pioneer missionaries. Going back, I was trying to find a book that she'd written that has some of the detail in it, because I can't remember all but going back, grandparents and great-greats, missionaries in China and India, some of the very first missionaries there. And my great-grandfather possibly was one of the co-founders of the modern missionary movement. So a lot of missionary pedigree there. And my grandparents, my mum's parents, were missionaries in China. So my mum and her family, her siblings, grew up in China. And my grandfather was an amazing surgeon who went with his wife to China, and they not only planted churches, worked with the local people planting churches, but they also established a hospital, possibly schools. I know my mum has been back and the hospitals are still there with his name on it. And in fact, he was granted a medal by the Chinese emperor for his service in combating the plague. So the bubonic plague that we think of from centuries ago hit China around the time that they were living there. And he worked out that it was caused by fleas jumping. And so he developed protective material, a protective outfit that enabled him to treat patients without him being infected. And he got an award for the emperor for that. So they were missionaries there. My grandmother, my mother's mother, very sadly died when my mum was 6. She contracted typhoid, and they were living in a very rural area. And even though he was a skilled surgeon, he didn't have the medication that he needed. So he nursed her, and she died in his arms. So was heartbroken. And then during the war, my mum and her siblings were all at a school for missionary kids called Chifu. And that whole school was taken captive by the Japanese, and they were taken into a Japanese internment camp. So she spent the she spent the war in an internment camp with her siblings, and it's another whole amazing story as to how they then got out and were reunited with her father, who took this incredible trek across war-torn China to find his children, not knowing if they were still alive or not. I mean, it's all very dramatic and film-like.
A novel and a movie.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
My goodness. So with all that rich, varied family history, what was that like for you as a kid growing up? Because again, I'm just interlace myself a little here. So my family, grandparents from Newcastle, post-war, didn't talk about anything. It was like it was just a hole in the ground. There was nothing to talk about or be excited about, look forward to. But I just like, what a rich background. Did that intimidate you as a kid, or was it exciting for you, or what did it mean for you when you were growing up?
I don't know that it meant anything as such, but very much grew up with a strong understanding of my family. I mean, I guess at that point you don't realize that any of these things are amazing, do you? They're just part of what you grow up with in family life, but certainly grew up with the strong identity around family and the family stories from both sides. And unlike your parents and family that were very much, they wanted to talk about it and were very open about it. Yeah, I think it's woven itself into me. I'm aware of coming from a rich family heritage. But then I think once you start talking to people, you realise that everybody does in different ways, and you uncover all sorts of amazing stories in people's lives. So I'm not unique in that.
You do. You say heritage. Do you feel like as life has gone on that you've unpacked some of that heritage? Do you find yourself thinking, or relatives saying, cool, you're just like your great aunt or uncle or grandparent or mum and dad?
It doesn't tend to go back further than my parents. So people will often say that I look like my dad, or when I'm speaking, I look like my dad, or I've inherited traits from him and from my mum, different things too, because my parents have become quite well-known speakers and preachers, so people know them and then see me. What delights them is the point at which people started saying to them, oh, you're Ruth Valerio's father, or you're Ruth Valerio's mother, whereas always it had been, oh, you're Martin Elizabeth Goldsmith's daughter. So they thought that was great when that changed.
Oh, isn't that lovely that they delighted in getting their identity from you?
Yes, yeah.
That tells us a lot about your parents.
Yeah, no, they're wonderful.
Fantastic. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about your parents? It's been fascinating in all these interviews we've done, over 20 of them. It seems to me that people's parents are usually quite different to one another temperamentally, not always, but often. What were your parents like in temperament and their relationship with each other?
Well, they're certainly different in upbringing. So my dad, as I've said, came from a very wealthy public school background. Then my mum was from a much poorer background. So when the war ended and they were able to get out of China, they arrived. So my grandfather and his 6 children, with no wife, no mother, arrived back in England, wasn't back for the children, arrived in England on the boat, stepped off, literally had just the clothes that they were wearing, and were met at the port by women as part of the war effort who had knitted returning people who knows, I don't know what the terms are, but had knitted them jumpers, and so they were given a jumper when they returned back. So then they had to start life again. So they both had a very different background. Different personalities. Well, they had just both had to cope with different things. So my mum had all the trauma of those being in the internment camp, losing a mother, the different impact that had on her and each of her siblings, having to establish a new life now in England that actually she'd never known before. And my dad had the trauma of not knowing his dad. My mum was brought up in a Christian home, obviously, so she was always a Christian. Then my dad, although it was Jewish family, they weren't particularly religious, so he wasn't brought up with any religion. And to begin with, he went into the Navy and was quite hard. He describes himself, though it's hard ever to imagine, he describes himself as quite a hard drinker, hard talker, swore a lot, got angry a lot, then became a Christian at university, and that just absolute transformation. And now I can't imagine my dad ever being like that. So they had a very different background. Then they met at missionary training. They were both called to be missionaries overseas, and the place where they went for language training and that initial training was where they met. And they were both going out to Asia. My dad proposed to mum constantly through the boat trip out. You know, you didn't fly in those days, they took a boat out. And my mum wasn't convinced at all and kept saying no, and then finally said yes. So they've come from very different backgrounds, and I think have started.
Can I just ask, does she tell the stories why she finally said yes, and where was she? Was they on the ship when she said yes?
I can't remember. I think so. My dad likes to say that he proposed to her and every port that on the trip that he's proposed to her. You know, he holds the world record for marriage proposals. I don't remember. I think possibly they were on the boat, and I don't remember what they would say around why, or what she would say. I think she just wasn't convinced to begin with, and then something changed. I don't know. So they are very different. They're very different, but also they've been together for so long and are so absolutely committed and are still deeply in love with each other, that although they are different, they're so entwined, it's also quite hard to talk about the difference, because they're a beautiful couple.
Oh, isn't that lovely? Wonderful, wonderful. So when you were growing up, what was it? What was faith and Christianity like for you?
It was very much a part of my life, just a natural part of my upbringing. So I would say I've never become a Christian. I've always just grown up being friends with Jesus, knowing that Jesus was my friend, and never having a reason to stop being Jesus's friends. There was my mum would talk about a song that we used to sing when I was little that have the words, into my heart, come into my heart, Lord Jesus. Come in today, come in to stay, into my heart, Lord Jesus. Though I think I used to think it was come in today, come in to play. But anyway.
Oh, I like that.
And she remembers us singing that together when I was 4. So maybe that's a moment for me, I'm not sure. But as far as I'm concerned, I've just always grown up knowing that I'm friends with God, and then it's just taken different developments. And
that's something that you seem to, I guess, means a lot to you.
So I've always grown up with a regular daily pattern of reading the Bible and praying. Your classic quiet time was instilled in me from early on, and I've kept that going ever since. So it's always been a part of my life.
We'll get onto your research later and the effects of consumerism on faith and stuff. And even here at this point, it reminds me, I had a very dramatic conversion experience at 17. And I remember when I was a little bit older, people say, I wish, who'd grown up in the church were a bit jaded and thought, I wish they. Whereas my wife grew up in a Brethren church, and a bit like you, just has this very close relationship with Jesus as a little child. And I remember what I went through, and I would say to my friends, I say, you're joking, I would rather have what you have than go through what I went through as a child to find that. It's interesting, isn't it? Dynamics of relationships and intensity and what's meaningful. But yours was meaningful from an early age and stayed meaningful.
Yes, yeah, has just got deeper. Yes, I was always very envious of people who had a dramatic conversion. My husband, as was, had a dramatic conversion, and I was always not always, but in a teasing way, envious that he'd had this huge conversion that he could stand up at the front and talk about, and I didn't really have anything to say.
See, my wife just has, my childhood was full of many other things, but just that richness, we're just like the Bible, in a lovely way, just a depth, you can't get unless you spent 3 hours every Sunday and time midweek for the first 18 years of her life in a lovely church family. I'm very envious of that.
Yeah. Though having said that, it wasn't, having had 18, 19 years of reading the Bible every day, it wasn't till I went to university and read theology that I actually realised that the Bible was one story rather than a collection of different books, and that the books came together sort of chronologically and to tell a story. And bizarrely, and maybe that that says something about the way that the Quiet Times were designed. Bizarrely, I had never realised that. And suddenly I could say, oh, this is what happened, and Israel did this, and then that happened, and then they went into, and track it forward from that. So that was quite a revelation when I realised that.
Oh, great. Yeah, we'll get to university and theology and what that did to your faith. Looking at your CV and our researcher, Simon, he's found out that you're involved with so many recent developments of the UK Evangelical Church for the last few decades, an awakening to national and international social justice, human rights, advocacy, the environment, personal sustainable living, and the 24/7 prayer movement and new monasticism. quite a lot going on there for us to unpack with you today. So as we move on into your life, let's move on with a question that we ask all our guests. If there are any other relatives that stand out for you, people that were particularly influential, or other mentors and people in your especially in your earlier life before we'll get to university in a moment.
Any family, did you say?
Yeah, family, friends, mentors, teachers, anybody who was particularly influential when you were growing up?
My sister was, actually. So she's 7 years older than me. So it was always, excuse me, very much big sister there. We had that definitely big sister, little sister relationship. When we were much younger, she used to play at schools, and she was a teacher, and I think this is probably before I went to school. We did this whole elaborate school thing with bits on paper, and she taught me to read. And so she was my mentor often in many ways, but in some ways still continues to be so. We're very close and live quite closely. And she met her, so she's 7 years older than me. When she, excuse me, when she was 16, she met the man who she went on to marry and is still married to. And together they were part of the early charismatic movement, and really saw a move of God in Chichester, in the Anglican church that they were a part of, in the youth group, and then went on to start a church, which the 24/7 prayer movement came out of, and so on. But they discovered the Holy Spirit, who clearly was already very much part of my life and very present in my life. But they discovered the Holy Spirit in a new way. And I can remember my sister praying, sitting on my bed and asking me if I'd like to be filled with the Holy Spirit when I don't know, I may have been 10 or something. And she prayed for me, and I started speaking in tongues and had a picture, and that was quite a clear moment for me. So she and the gateway then into the a more charismatic expression of faith. Has been influential in my life, not in terms of mentoring, but actually one of my mum's brothers, Uncle John, who's my favourite uncle. It has his own amazing life, and he ended up, after China coming in here, ended up at Cambridge studying engineering, then went over to, wanted a new life, so went to the States, ended up in what became Silicon Valley, and started up a little choir group with some of his friends from work, and can remember after one of the singing evenings chatting with one of his friends who said to him, I'm going to leave work and set up a new company. I think I'm going to call it Intel. And and he, at work, he sat next to Bob Hewlett and someone else whose surname is Packard, and so he was right in all of that revolution there. But he and I loved him. He's wonderful, but not so much from a mentoring. Just fascinating hearing his background.
Another giant.
Yes.
Part of your family story. My goodness. Wow. And was there anything, Ruth, in growing up, big or small, in terms of relationships or influences that you look back on that were formative for what you're doing now? Which, if I say, let's put it under advocacy and environmentalism, and what was there anything that stirred in you when you were younger that you've been unpacking since?
Not really. The only thing that stands out is more of an experience that I was, towards the end of my primary school, I was quite bullied. I had my best friend turned against me and then turned the rest of the class against me, and I was quite bullied. And just unpacking that some years ago with a spiritual advisor, a coach or someone, mentor, she got me to think through what impact that has had. And I think, despite all the negative side of that, positively, actually, it put some resilience in me. And I think I became a little bit of a rebel, not in a terrible way, but just doing things that made me stand out a bit. And I think it's fed into then my ability to withstand being teased and laughed at, certainly in the early years of the more the environmental side of my commitment, when family and friends in my church just didn't get it and thought I was slightly weird. And it was just interesting with my coach, so unpacking the way that God has used that positively.
Yeah, over time that unpacks. Yeah.
But nothing else particular, other than the fact that my mum just engendered in me an absolute love for the natural world. So she'll always, whenever we go out, or she would always be saying, "Oh, isn't the Lord amazing to have made such a wonderful creation?"
Fantastic. Brilliant. Now, some people stay in one place when they're growing up. Other people move around a lot with their parents. What about you? What happened in your childhood?
Stayed absolutely in the same place. So my parents still live in the house that they lived in before I was born. In fact, I was given birth to in their bedroom. So they still live in that house, and that's where I was brought up. And the house I live in,
they can never move, ever.
Sorry?
You decided they can never move. Like my children only remember one house that I lived in.
Yes.
They've forbidden to ever move.
Yeah, no, that's right. They will at some point. But they've lived there all this time. So was brought up in the same place. And just your previous question, I do think there must have been something formative in me having been brought up in an international Bible college. So was surrounded by people from other nationalities, and just that diversity there of cultures and food and so on. So I'm sure that must play in to how I am today in some way.
Must do, in the ways that we know and ways that we don't know. It's here's an area. So I grew up in Luton, which was not short of Indian restaurants.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had my first curry when I went to London School of Theology at 18. in Northwood, Middlesex,
Yeah.
Jewish epicenter, and someone said to me, "Why?" They just couldn't understand it because my parents were just so anglicised and cut off from anything cultural or anything exciting. It completely bypassed me in my local environment, and I live next to a mosque. You think I might have had a curry? But,
well, you can live somewhere, can't you, and just not see or know what's going on around you. Yeah, you just live in your own bubble.
So what's did you say it was Harlow?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I find when I go back to Luton, which I still consider home, it's so familiar and so alien at the same time because it's changed.
Well, so I
what's it like for you when you go back?
Well, I was in hospital in Harlow. That's where I was born, but I was brought up. My parents' house is in the little village that the Bible college is in. So, so when I go back to the little village there, and it has changed. It's on a train line to London, so it's part of the commuter belt, and there's more housing there, and the shops I knew in the village high street, they've all changed, but it's still the same in so many ways. And actually I've been enjoying going back more recently and discovering some of the history and the heritage that's there. So like you were saying, living next door to something and never having given it a second thought. When I was back, well, probably a couple of years ago now, there's a maltings, and I grew up, you could always smell it, that when they were, the whole air would fill with the smell from the maltings for beer, and I think that's the main thing, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. Beer.
And the building now, the big factory, has now been, it's got some work in it, but there's some flats in there and things. But it's right across the road. I've never gone into it. And a couple of years ago, I thought, I'm going to have a little walk around. Fascinating. So full of heritage. There's a river, a little stream that goes through it with a mill, which they would have used to power the maltings. All the part of the Industrial Revolution, how it was linked with the life of the village, and the All Nations College is part of it is the big village, sort of the country mansion, and the Lord of the Manor who would have lived there, and how it's linked with that, and just realizing, gosh, and actually the village is mentioned in the Doomsday Book, which I never realized. So I've really enjoyed going back and discovering some of the history and the heritage there that I wasn't aware of.
And it was all right under your nose.
Yes.
Literally, including the smell.
Yes.
Issue with COVID, I call them my Boris walks. And I know my locality quite well. I've lived here a long time, but it's just been a delight to be present and enjoy, just to pay more attention to little things that you just never notice right where you are. I don't need to, it's really helped me with, I don't need to get on an airplane to find somewhere to find something fascinating. There's something fascinating right where I am. Yeah. Brilliant. So can we talk about your early education? Now, you talked about the bullying, but other than the bullying, was your education, was it as exciting as your family and this locality that you were in, or was it a bit pedestrian?
No, it was very normal. I went to, so we lived in this little village. For some reason, didn't actually go to the local village primary school, just one where WARE is next door. So went to the Church of England school. Actually, that's why, because we were part of the church there. So we went to the Church of England school. I went to the primary school that was next to it. So that was fine. Apart from the bullying at the end, it was a happy education. And then from there, went to a comprehensive school in Hertford called Simon Ball School, which was a mixed education, mixed, co-ed, pretty basic, comprehensive school, and then did something slightly strange and went to a very expensive public school and boarded for the sixth form.
Thank you.
Which I can go into if you want to.
Yeah, that's big. That's quite a change. How did that happen?
Yeah, so it was something about, it's kind of linked with my dad, who has a very public school background. So I'm not even completely fully sure. My brother went to boarding school all the way through from the age of 8 anyway. And the school that he went to, the main school, not after the prep school, but from 13, Haileybury College, is quite near to us. And at that point, it didn't take girls until the 6th form. And so both my sister and I went to comprehensive for most of it. And then for the 6th form, went to Haileybury and just did that. And I'm still not ever quite sure why we did that, but anyway, it gave me a little bit of public school education at the end, and I was doing well academically at the comprehensive, so I don't know whether it impacted that or not, but it did give me a bit of public school exposure into a different world and a different life, which was
that wasn't a shock going from comprehensive to public school. Did you just take it in your stride and enjoy it?
Yeah, I think I just took it in my stride. One of my friends owned Red Rum. You might remember one. Racing horse back then. So it was definitely a whole different world. And when it came to, if there was a weekend or end of the holidays when the parents turned up to collect you, all of the very smart cars. My parents had a little Ford Fiesta. So, but it's a funny thing. But yeah, so I had that at the end of my education. But before that, it was pretty normal.
Yeah. So, thinking about university, were you already knew what you wanted to do for university before you went to 6th form, or did something take shape at 6th form college for you?
No, it definitely took shape during 6th form. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I think I always, this is going to sound odd now looking back on it, I think I always pretty much assumed I was going to go to Oxbridge. So my family my brother went to Oxford, my sister went to Cambridge, most of my mum's siblings, my dad, all of his side are high academics. One of my uncles, when I was doing maths, I think they were called SMP. All of the textbooks were written by him. A great uncle was a maths genius at Oxford.
Of course, Indiana Jones was someone. I'm waiting for him to crop up.
So I think it was just sort of assumed that I would go to Oxbridge, which looking back on it is a crazy assumption. But anyway, so I went through the process of, I decided I wanted to go. Cambridge was where I wanted to go, and I was quite good at history, so that's what I thought. But I didn't have any thought for what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be. I went to see a careers advisor at school, and very helpfully she told me that the best career for me was being a careers advisor. What kind of careers advice is that? So I didn't really have a clue what I wanted to be or to do.
Oh, wow. Gosh. Now, we've recently interviewed 2 graduates of Cambridge University. So Dr. Anna Rowlands, Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University, who I know you know, and then Linda Woodhead, who's Distinguished Professor of Religion and Society at Lancaster University. And both of them come from quite ordinary backgrounds, less adventurous than yours, perhaps. But Anna, it's interesting talking with Anna. She talked about what a huge cultural shock it was for her going to Cambridge and almost left. Linda absolutely loved it from her comprehensive background. So that leads me to my question. What was it like, after expecting to go? What was it like for you?
Yeah, it was a mix for me, as was my time at Haileybury, which was also a mix. And I think it links in a bit with what I touched on with being a bit, when I say a bit of a rebel, not wanting to conform. Something has been instilled in me. I think it comes from my dad. Something has been instilled in me of not wanting to conform. And if you're in something like a public school or Cambridge, it has got quite well, I don't know, Cambridge is maybe not conforming because, you know, it wants to generate creativity and not conforming new ideas, but I think the public school system is. So, and I never really wanted to be part of the in crowd, but also struggled with the fact that I wasn't, and but I didn't want to be with you were kind of either cool or you were square, and I wasn't square because I was a bit different, but I didn't really fit in with the in crowd either. And I was a bit like that at Haileybury and at Cambridge. But at Cambridge, I established myself with some good friends. And although there were some times when I really missed home, and it was blooming hard work, you worked jolly hard. I loved it. I loved being there, like I did at Haileybury. I loved the buildings and the beauty of it, and being there. But in the similar way to what we've said about other things, I've almost had no idea of wider Cambridge. I just lived in my college and where I was studying, and going back, I didn't even go to the Fitzwilliam Museum or anything. There was a whole world that I didn't know existed. It's quite incredible how you can
like
just be so insular.
It was all like the Maltings. It was all there.
Yes, but no, I loved it. I really enjoyed my time there.
Were you aware? Did you have a sense of privilege? You know, I mean, in the right sense, a good sense.
No, I didn't actually.
Did it just seem normal?
Yeah, it did. And you're with lots of people, and they're all very normal. You know, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Actually, my best friend wasn't from a public school background, and a couple of the other friends weren't either. No, it was very normal. I was struggling with the Christian side of it in terms of the CU. So the CU was pretty conservative in its outlook. I really wanted to get stuck into the Christian side of it, but the CU was very conservative, wouldn't have a woman to speak, and so my non-conformist side came out quite strongly, and I butted heads against the CU presidents quite often, and eventually I couldn't be bothered with it anymore. So I was part of a student group that was linked to the church that I went to there.
Yeah, I'll ask you about the church in a moment, the experience there. So do you feel like you enjoyed your studies, made the most of it, you know, with your reading and tutorials? And
I really did love it. So although I got in to do history, I actually during my gap year decided to change and went to read what's called divinity, known as you know, theology anywhere else. So but decided to change and read theology. So was spending all my time studying that. How can I put that? In some ways I didn't make the most of it, because coming from an evangelical background, I was quite nervous of doing, and really lacking in confidence in my own ability. So I avoided any of the ethics courses, any of the philosophy type courses, because I didn't think I could do them. I didn't think I was clever enough to do them. So I stuck with what I felt most familiar with, which was the biblical studies part of the theology course. And looking back, that's fine, because you can't do everything anyway. And it meant that I got some really good biblical studies teaching, even though it's a secular course in that sense. So it's not like going to a Bible college. But I loved it. Learned Greek, loved reading the passages in the Greek and studying it. It really deepened my faith.
Wonderful. Yeah, I wonder what it did for your faith. Lots of people, theological studies can either, and again, in the interviews.
Yeah, people were very worried.
Brings it alive, yeah.
Yeah, they thought if I went to Cambridge to read theology, I would lose my faith. So they put me in contact, people I knew put me in contact with other people. So I had folks to talk to. Roger Forster, when I would come home in the holidays, I'd get together with Roger Forster and go through some things with him, which was such a privilege.
I won't try and do an impression of Roger Forster, because I'll sound like I'm doing an impression of Pete Gregg doing an impression of Roger Forster.
Oh, he was wonderful. He would give me 3 hours of his time every holiday. He was so generous. And I, what's it called? Not Ridley Hall. There's a library, an evangelical research library, Tyndale. So I went to see the warden and just explained, as I was doing my studies, could I come and spend some time there? And that gave me access to books that gave me a different perspective to the books that were in the university library. They didn't really have any evangelical theology books there. So I got access to a whole range of other voices that I wouldn't have got through the university, and got to speak to some of the people who were doing their research there. So at one point, Don Carson was writing something. I'd not heard of him particularly, but I can remember knocking on his little sort of cubicle. I knew he was doing something on the New Testament and said, could I ask you a question about something? So I did, and he very kindly gave me his thoughts. So that really helped me.
Fantastic. Now, yeah, that leads me nicely onto it. I'll come back. I'm still holding just an abeyance for a moment your church life there. But I understand you read a book about environmental care, and you realised that, quote, a whole chunk of your Christian faith was missing. Where was this book? Was that part of your divinity theology course, or was it over at Tyndale?
No, it wasn't at all. So this was 1991, the time of the Rio Earth Summit, and Spring Harvest and Tearfund decided right ahead of their game, decided that they wanted to, So 1991, the Rio Earth Summit prompted Spring Harvest and Tearfund to run a campaign alongside, or aligned with the Rio Earth Summit, but aimed at Christians in the UK to get them engaged with the themes that the Earth Summit was touching on. So they ran a campaign or an initiative called Whose Earth? And it was a big thing. They had a rally in Hyde Park, and they produced materials. And one of the things they did was produce this little book called Whose Earth, written by someone called Chris Seaton, who actually was in my church, was one of the leaders of my church. And so I read that book. I must have had some sort of interest in it because someone, maybe Chris, said, I think you'd enjoy this. But I don't remember why that person was prompted to give it to me, but there must have been a reason. So I, during one of my holidays, sat and read this book, and it was very little, and it just went through really simply, what does the Bible say about environmental care, about the wider world? And it really was like the scales fell from my eyes. I can remember the bed I was sitting on when I read it. It was totally transformatory. And I just, as you said, realised that a whole chunk of my faith had been missing. And I'd never before realised that the Bible had so much to say about not only about people, but about the whole world that God had created. So it really was a defining moment for me.
Wonderful. We'll unpack that a little bit in a moment, what that led to. So yeah, your faith, you mentioned church. What was that like? These new friends that you made in church, was that a vital and integrated?
Not really. So quite early during primary school, we moved from the church that was linked to my primary school to the little village Anglican church, and there wasn't ever that much going on in it. And they try as they might, they couldn't ever really get. There was a bit of a youth group, but nothing very much. What was formative for me was Spring Harvest. Whenever it started up, I would have been sort of heading towards teens, but probably pre-teens, I think. But my parents spoke there, and then a bit later, my sister and her then husband spoke there. And so all through my teenage years, I went as a punter, a guest, and went into the youth programs. And that was what kept me going through my teenage years. So my faith would kind of go down, 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 down. And then spring harvest would pin it back again each year. So I didn't particularly have friends, local friends who were Christians, but it was spring harvest that kept me going.
Right. And was that all the same through university as well? Spring harvest still a highlight for you?
No, not so much. By that point, the church that I'm still a part of was up and running. That started, I think, when I was 13. So that was beginning to be more influential in my life. And through my uni holidays, I would come down to Chichester, where the church is, and would stay there. So I wouldn't go back home. I would come here. So I was very much a part of that church by that point. So Spring Harvest was still a part of my life, but the church was really playing a big part and helping give me increase my dynamic faith, keep me rooted.
So during that university time, either in the church in Chichester or in Cambridge, were there any other mentors or people that stood out for you, lecturers, professors?
There was, when I was at Cambridge, the church leader who set up the student, so the student leader for the church that I went to, which is called C3, was still is a wonderful chap called Jonathan, and he was quite a mentor to me through my student years. So he led the student work there. Funnily enough, he and his family actually moved down to Chichester too, so they live not that far from me. He has since gone on to become a pagan and a practicing. He's I guess you'd call him a witch. It's sort of literally, not in a derogatory term. Yeah. And he leads a pagan group. I won't say coven, but that's such a inflammatory term. But so he's become very immersed in paganism, because as he began exploring more around the natural world, the church wasn't meeting some of the things that he was thinking about. And it's quite interesting hearing his journey in that. But yeah, that's another story.
It is another story. So yeah, my wife and I met at London School of Theology, 18, 19, and we, meet up with friends regularly, and we do that. What's happened to people over the years, and it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Sad and amazing in other ways, where everybody ends up over life.
Yeah.
So after Cambridge, what did you do next?
Yep, after Cambridge, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had fallen in love with theology, so absolutely loved that. So wanted to try and keep that going in some way, but didn't know how. I went on from there to do a part-time MA at London School of Theology. So when were you there?
Oh, I was there, did my BA from 88 to 19. See, I forget now. 91.
Okay, no, well, I was there. I was there after that anyway. Yeah. So yeah. I did part-time and sorry.
Who was your supervisor?
For my thesis, it was Derek Tidball. He was the principal at that point. Yeah. And then my Old Testament was Derek Sheriffs and Max Turner for Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Conrad.
Anthony Billington.
Yes, he was there. Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So I did a part-time MA there and got a job as part-time research assistant for Clive Calver, who was at that point was the Director General of the Evangelical Alliance. And he was increasingly doing lots of media things and talks, but mostly media things, and needed some research into different topics that he was asked to speak into. So that was fascinating. And I can remember there was quite seminal for me. There was one series he was doing on the for the BBC World Service with him and other religious. I think Julia Neuberger might have been the Jewish representative and a Muslim person. I can't remember. And there was 5 topics of ethical issues, looking at things like euthanasia and abortion. I can't remember all of them, but one of them was the arms trade. And neither him nor me knew anything about the arms trade. So I needed to go off and do some research around that, and did that at the same time as I was visiting, doing some work in Ethiopia in the slums, and visiting a project there. And that was one of the first times in my gap year, I'd done some work in Malaysia with a social care group, but this was extreme poverty like I'd not seen before. And doing the research around the arms trade just opened my eyes to a whole level of injustice and oppression that I knew nothing about, and also opened my eyes to the reality of our complicity in a horrendous system that where I was, you know, through my banking, any investments I probably didn't have at that point, but might have. And well, through my banking, I realised that I was helping to fund the arms trade, and all these terrible atrocities I was reading about, I was involved with. So that opened my eyes to the links between how we live and what happens elsewhere. So that was one of the key moments for me in that role.
Did you end up as a researcher there because you needed a job, and then it led to all this stuff you found out, or did you have an interest in research and said, "Hey, Clive, I think I could help you with this"? Or
yeah, no, I was just looking for what to do after university, and someone I knew who was part of my church was working at the EA, was kind of Clive's right-hand man, really. So he had the idea that Clive was getting to a point where he was needing some support. So he said, "Oh, why don't you have Ruth in, and she could give you a bit of some part-time support."
all right, wow.
Yeah, so it was quite ad hoc in that way, sort of informal. I don't think it wasn't advertised. I didn't have an interview. It just happened.
Yeah, well, my next question was going to be, we interviewed Joel Edwards last year.
Yes.
Now,
yeah,
we're getting ready to release all these interviews, so it's quite poignant looking back on that 3 hours we had with him last year. And so for people listening, Joel is the former General Director of the Evangelical Alliance. I think you and he overlapped.
Yes, we did. He was my boss at that point.
Well, he talked about how the EA had rediscovered its roots in social responsibility, and used that word rediscovering. Did you find that? Was there a rediscovery, or was it something you put in place? Or
I think that was all part of what was happening when I was there. So after I was Clive's research assistant, I then got a full-time, a proper job at the EA, and was head of social responsibility. So I was helping to lead some of those things, but very much it was already in process. It wasn't that I was the instigator of it all. It was in process, and yes, very, very much so, very aware. The EA was very aware of the strong evangelical heritage in movements of social reform, or whether it's around the factories or the slave trade, or just the really positive influence that evangelicalism has had, and saw itself in that line.
Yeah, it's amazing the amnesia most evangelicals to their own evangelical tradition, and especially historic issues of social responsibility.
Yeah.
We also interviewed Pete Meadows,
who
seems to have been around forever.
Indeed.
Done everything. But we also talked about the links between the Evangelical Alliance and the growth of Christian festivals, and that touched on spring harvest. So other than a punter, did your and different family members speaking at Spring Harvest, how did your role in Spring Harvest develop?
That came about again through the work I was doing at the EA, and as my theological studies were developing. And I guess it's kind of being in the right place and being in the right circles. Someone recommended me as a speaker at Spring Harvest, So that was when I was 24. So I was the youngest ever adult speaker to speak there. I happened to, like, along with a palindromic birth date, that was something I hold dearly. So I started to speak there when I was 24 and spoke every year for 21 years. And at one point was asked onto the leadership team. So I was part of the leadership team for 10 years or something. I chaired Spring Harvest at one point, was part of the board. So having been so influential in my life through my teenage years, it's very nice that I then went on to play such a part and to be so involved with it over many, many years.
Yeah, I bet. Now, Micah Jazz, as he is now, was Micah on the board with you at that time?
Yeah, so he was Clive's right-hand man, who recommended me to Clive, because he and Katie were part of our church for many, many, many years. So he's a
spiritual connection with Micah. So, lovely connection there.
Yeah.
Wow. So you've been associated, as we've already touched on, for many years with Chichester in West Sussex. And you decided to, if I've got this right, live with your family on the council estate and get heavily involved in social housing and tenant associations. And you have a Chichester City Civic Award for community service. So,
gosh,
I've forgotten about that. At Spring Harvest and a Chichester City Civic Award for community service. Is it not behind you? Where is this award?
No. It's probably in a box with other jewelry type things. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, this got my interest. I grew up on various council estates in Luton, or as my brother and I like to say, we were dragged up.
Yeah.
And remember what working class family life on council estates was like, including tower blocks that are now torn down and working men's clubs where family members drank too much. Mm-hmm. So yeah, what happened there? What was the impetus for that, and what led to the award?
Yeah, so actually before my environmental interest, starting from my gap year and then going through university and beyond, I was also learning about and having my eyes open to the Christian response of social responsibility and a Christian response to issues of poverty and injustice, and realizing effectively that I couldn't be a Christian without being interested in those things, that it's an essential part of the Christian faith to be caring for other people and responding to issues of poverty and being involved with people living in poverty and so on. When I was at university, that took a very local interest. So I got very involved with homeless guys. So I helped out at a project, sort of night shelter. But more than that, I used to spend quite a lot of my time actually just hanging out on the streets and sitting out on the pavements at night and chatting with them and just getting to know them and being a friendly face, I guess. I don't know what really, but just spent quite a bit of my time hanging out with them, literally sitting out on the pavements, begging with them at one point, seeing who would get the most amount of money. And that was a very strong theme for me, a strong strand that was developing around justice and increasingly taking a more global focus. So with my then husband, he was also on a similar track, and he started up a little charity, and we got involved, as I've mentioned, in a project in the slums in Addis Ababa, and in Tanzania and in India. So we were both really exploring global poverty and how to respond as a Christian, but also felt, well, what does that look like locally? Here we are in Chichester, which is a very nice area. How can we live out a worship of a God of justice more locally? So as part of a church move, we moved on to the estate that I now still live on. I've lived here, as I said, 26 years, I think. Just out of a desire of wanting to help. It was fast becoming a sink estate, had all of the sorts of problems you would associate with a working class white council estate predominantly. For quite a few years, really didn't know what to do, and then was I don't know how much detail to give you. I don't want to talk for too long, but got involved with some other residents in starting up a community association. So I was one of the people who founded it with a few others, and I agreed that I would chair it, but only if I co-chaired it, but not because it turns out that co-chairing is a brilliant model, because it means no one person has control and you're spreading responsibility and so on. So I learned a lot from that, but it wasn't because I thought it was a good idea. It's because I didn't have any confidence and didn't think I could chair this thing on my own. So I said I'd only do it if someone else does it with me. So I've got some help. So chaired the community association, co-chaired it for 12 years. And over those years as an association, as residents, we really saw the estate transformed into an estate that is now, I'm looking out, I can see it out my kitchen window, that is now a really lovely place to live. And that in itself is a long story around that. But it was because of my work on the estate and the part that I played in that I got the civic award.
And I can frame this next question right. Were you a novelty to people when you first came?
Yeah.
Public school, Cambridge background. What
yeah, so they didn't know any of that. And probably no one does. And I didn't talk sort of too poshly. I think I can speak differently depending on who I'm speaking to a bit. It's an estate where you're not really a resident or accepted until you've lived here for about 20 years. You know, it takes a very long time. You've got people here who were born and brought up on the estate and their parents lived on the estates post-war, so sort of 80 years maybe. And was also viewed quite suspiciously because of my church links. That was actually the most one. So my next door neighbour, when I first moved in, wouldn't let her daughter play in our garden, because she thought we were from a cult. So that took quite a while to break that down. But now, and interestingly, we moved on almost as missionaries, sort of from the church, moving on to the estate to do some good. And initially we tried planting a church, but that didn't work. But over the time, I became much less a missionary from the church living on the estate and just became one of the residents. And that's how I viewed myself, and still do, obviously. And so became much more part of the estate, and that soon disappeared, all of that.
Well, thank you. Now, there are so many other strands to your life. I'm going to try and keep weaving them together. So Chichester is one of the places, a key place that's known for the 24/7 prayer movement. So let's circle back into your church experience here at that time. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how are things going. So you're still in Chichester, you finished university, you're on this council estate, building relationships there. What was the church life and faith like for you at that time?
That was around the time of the Toronto Blessing. So, and we were one of the churches that were kind of one of the early ones at the front of that. So we were going through all of the craziness of the Toronto Blessing. All of the falling over, barking, roaring, you name it, it happened. I never felt, I kind of was a part of it, never felt entirely comfortable. I'm not sure, I don't think I ever fell over. I kind of always wanted to. I could see all these other people having all these experiences. I did have one or two deeper experiences, but I always felt slightly on the edge, while also kind of loving it and enjoying what was happening as well. So that was my, during my sort of 20s, that was my church experience. And Pete was a teenager. He'll have said in his interview, you know, he came over, he led the youth work, and I can remember him probably not quite as a teenager, but as a youth worker. And actually his parents knew my parents, so there's a bit of a connection too there. But yeah, I can remember Pete as a very young man coming and joining the church. And the very first 24/7 week of prayer, I can remember that, and going from there.
Yeah, so apart from Toronto Blessing, and anyone who's going to go might not know what that was. I'm in a vineyard church, so
yeah.
I used to say to my friends, they say, "So have you?" And I'd be slightly mischievous. I said, "So have you barked like a chicken yet?" What was, apart from that, what was this growing environmentalism, social responsibility, this daily mission life that you had? What was there an integration for you in the larger faith of the church?
Well, there should have been, because the person who wrote the book that was so influential for me was part of the leadership of that church. So they so the church was with church planted, and there were a few of them. So he wasn't part of the Chichester church, he was part of one of the other ones. And Micah Jazz, or Mike Morris, as he was then, who's very influential and sold out for issues of refugees and human rights and so on, and environmental care, was also part of the leadership. But somehow it wasn't integrated into the church. And for quite a long time, how can I put this? For quite a long time, I think, or at least I felt, and maybe it's not the case, I felt that I was viewed a bit suspiciously because I had a theology degree. And the church at that point was very experientially based and very sort of spirit versus word, rather than holding it together. I think in the early days of the church, it was operating in reaction to what it had moved away from. And so something like a theology degree or thinking didn't really fit in that well with the model of the church that was all about experiencing God and feeling his presence and so on. And then the environmental side didn't fit in at all. And it really is strange that it didn't. And the estate that I live on, we ran social care projects on the estate. So it was there, but it didn't, certainly the environmental side didn't come through at all. And the church leaders, other than these two, the church leaders didn't understand what I was saying. So that has changed.
So whilst you're growing environmentalism, living and working in this community, and you just mentioned in passing some of the things. You looked out the window at this estate. It was almost like on your face, I could see that you've done that a lot for a long time, and you could see the transformation. Have you got any anecdotes about some of the things that you started off? Was there an allotment or breeding pigs? There's showing my ignorance of what you were doing. But what were you doing? I'm sure it wasn't that.
Yeah, so that's slightly separate to what happened on the estate. For a number of years I had an allotment with friends, only stopped because I've got lots of grow things in my own garden, and kept pigs.
You did keep pigs?
Yes, I did.
As far as research goes, I thought this was, again, I thought, I guess, do I have to say this tongue in cheek when I ask you? But you did have
No, I started up a pig cooperative with some friends. And
I've never met anyone who started a pig cooperative.
Was involved in that for about 10 years. Well, that's separate to what was happening on the estate. Although we have done things, we've got a little orchard and a wildflower area on the estate and things. But that side, so as part of my growing environmental interest, through all of the reading that I was doing around it and learning, I realised that so many of the problems that we face come together around our food system and just how damaging our food system is. So as part of the different actions that I was wanting, or the different changes I was wanting to make in my life around all sorts of things, transport and energy and so on, food became probably the biggest area that I focused on, and wanting to do my food in a way that got me out of the global food system as much as possible. So that looked like beginning to grow my own veg, and so with friends took on a local allotment, getting an organic bag delivery every week, which I still get. And as I was reading around, began thinking about meat and animal welfare and all of those issues. And my church small group had in it some wonderful people who were thinking similarly to me and were also growing their own veg and keeping chickens. And I used to say to them, you know, what I'd really love to do would be to keep a pig. And I'd read about it with Hugh Fernley-Whittingstall, if you can see up on my shelf, in his early years at River Cottage. I'd read about his adventures with pigs, and I said, what I'd really love to do is keep pigs, and you rear them till they're the right weight, and then you slaughter them, and then you've got the meat. And we used to say this quite often. So after one midweek meeting, I said, well, look, we keep talking about this. Why don't we see if we can find some land and just give it a go? And one of the other people was the manager in social care for the social services, and he knew of a residential centre that had some spare scrubby land. So he approached them and said, could we try keeping some pigs on your land? You could join in, we could turn it, could be a social enterprise, the people who are in your care could come and join in, it could be part of your programme and so on. So we just started out, there were three of us, three couples with 3 pigs. And it was so successful that we...
3 pigs, literally.
Literally 3 pigs,
3 pigs.
Yeah. And it was so good that the next year we got some more, and then others wanted to join us. And then a couple of other separate schemes joined up, and we spawned a whole pig cooperative movement in the area. And it was great. So I did keep pigs for 10 years.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Only stopping because we now pretty much don't eat meat anymore. So there wasn't much point.
Before you became vegetarian.
Yeah, I'm not fully vegetarian, but yeah.
Okay, great. Tell us, I said it seemed almost accidental, the research role that you ended up with Clive Calver in the EA, but as you were exploring moves back into work, was your next role accidental, or was it something that you were looking for?
My next role was also at the EA, and that was the head of social responsibility role. So that was a bit more deliberate.
Yeah.
But also pragmatic, you know, young at that point, and Clive was moving. This is when Clive was leaving, going to America, and Joel was coming in. So the research role with Clive was finishing. So I needed to find another job, and this one became available at that time. So I applied and took that one. So it wasn't with a huge amount of thought. And I think just in general, as I look back over my life, I would say so much, probably everything that I've ended up doing has been unplanned, and not with a view of I'm going to end up doing this thing or starting this thing. I mean, it really, really has been God leading me through. You know, when we moved onto the estate, had no idea. You didn't plan, or I want to turn the estate into this and win awards and so on. And we got City and Bloom awards on the estate and all sorts of different things. It's been a case in curriculums, and none of that was planned. And it has been God all the way through, 100%.
Oh, brilliant. So tell me how you ended up at A Rocha.
When I was at the EA, just at the so 1999, I think, or 2000, but I think 1999, they held a National Evangelical Congress, a big thing held in a big conference centre in Cardiff. And I was asked to do a seminar on creation care. and they asked me to do it, to co-speak with someone called Dave Bookless, who I'd never heard of, not come across before. At that point, I was well into my environmental thinking and becoming known a little bit as a speaker, and was writing some articles and so on, and really thought I was on my own, just thought I was the only Christian who thought these things. There's a quote I came across by a chap called Aldo Leopold, and he, who was one of in America, one of the pioneers of the simplicity movement and the wilderness movement, not a Christian. And he said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. So one of the penalties, one of the downsides of an ecological education, of understanding what's going on in this world, is that one lives alone. You're on your own in a world of wounds. And I just absolutely felt like that. I felt like all these problems I was hearing about, I was carrying. No one else in the Christian world understood me. And then I did this seminar with Dave Bookless and discovered, oh, someone else is thinking the same and saying the same things as me. So I found a kindred spirit in Dave. And Dave is the person who founded A Rocha UK. So from that point, although I didn't actually work formally with A Rocha UK for many years, at that point we connected. So from then on, he would ask me in to speak at conferences, and we would do different things together. So from that point, I was connected with A Rocha, even if I didn't formally work for them for quite a number of years, and just found another bunch of strange Christians who thought the same way that I did.
Brilliant. Now, there's a story I want to unpack with you about, I understand you transformed an eco-congregation into an eco-church project.
I did.
And got a lot more traction and involvement in a very short period of time, in a few months, than the previous 15 years. Could you tell us what that was all about?
Yes, so this is my first, so I'd been doing some things with A Rocha, and this is my first really formalised role with them, which was after I'd finished my PhD. Sorry, I'm just going to pause, I can't remember. I think it was 2013 I finished my PhD. So after that I had some more time, and so offered my services and became Church and Theology Director with A Rocha UK, took over from someone who was retiring. And as part of that remit, that job oversaw the existing eco-congregation scheme, which was there to help churches engage with environmental care. And it was a great idea, but the scheme had got a bit tired and needed revamping. So I took that on and developed Eco Church, which was much more up to date. It's online. You fill in a survey and it adds up your points online. It's all very intuitive. Rather, before you had to submit paper reports and things, and it just wasn't where we are now. And lots of resources. So I felt like the ground, that seeds had been sown. I could see this bare ground, but it had lots of seeds in it. And Eco Church felt like it was a watering can, watering the bare ground, and then the seeds just came up. So I think by that point, lots of churches were beginning to wake up to the call to be caring for the whole creation, but really didn't know how to do it. And this gave them the means to do that. So we had a big launch at St. Paul's. Rowan Williams spoke at that, and thousands. Within a few years, thousands of churches were engaged with it. I think with the Eco Church, 300 and something got an Eco Church, an Eco Congregation Award in 15 years, and thousands are now involved with Eco Church. So yeah, it was great, really, really encouraging, and it feels like it was an encouragement to those who were already involved but had been feeling like they'd been pushing water uphill. It just gave them the resource that they were looking for.
Yeah, and terms of web addresses, so that's ecochurch.arocha.org.uk, is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if people just put Eco Church
Yeah.
into their search engine, then they'll find it.
Brilliant. So could you tell us how you ended up going on to do your doctorate? Why did you want to do?
Yeah, I was getting towards the point where I had one daughter at school and one daughter with 1 year left at nursery. So beginning to look forward to what happens when both children are at school. And a conversation around that in the car going somewhere with Greg, we were thinking, what might I do next? And he said, oh, you should do some further studies. And I said, oh, well, no, I don't think I said no, actually. I think I thought, oh yeah, I'd love to do that. So I went through a whole process of thinking through what could I do, and did look at doing a PhD at King's College. And then as I was in the process of applying for that, saw in the brochure that there was this other thing called a DTH Min, a Doctorate in Theology and Ministry. And so I contacted the person who was responsible for that, Luke Brotherton, who you know, and we had a chat through about it. And he said to me, a PhD is for someone who wants to be a professional scholar, but this other doctorate is for someone who wants to be a scholarly professional. And that really hit a note for me, because I knew I didn't want to have a career in academia, but I did want to think deeply and theologically and in a scholarly fashion about the things that I was talking about and the way I was trying to live and so on. And so I decided to do this doctorate in theology and ministry with the big thesis at the end. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. It was brilliant. It took me 7 years because I had primary school children, so I was primary carer and also working part-time. So I was working part-time, PhD or doctorate part-time, other everything else part-time, but it was great.
I know we overlapped at the beginning of my PhD in research, and with all my interruptions that I had, yes, I don't miss formatting. I was reading through your thesis the other day.
Oh, were you? Gosh.
Yeah, there are those. I thought, do you know, I don't have an attention to close detail like that, but ended up with it.
Yeah.
And started dreaming, and I was using Chicago version 16 or something, my formatting. I thought, what has become of me that I notice where commas and...
Yeah, but it stands you in good stead to understand these things and to be able to write well, and
it does.
It's in the right place.
Part of the formation. Yeah, and I went straight to your bibliography and enjoyed seeing Charles Matthews on there and Vincent Miller, and some overlap between us, which I'm sure would have been with Luke Brotherton. So back to my questions here. So yes, you do. So with your Doctor of Theology and Ministry, did you go into it knowing exactly what you wanted to do? Were you trying to find out something? What was
I went into it with no other view than it felt like it would be a good arrow in my quiver, or a string in my bow or something. It just felt like a good other thing to do and to have. But it wasn't with a view to anything. And as I've said, I wasn't wanting to go into academia or use it in that way at all. So as you will have picked up, I don't tend to go into things with a very clear view or very clear vision, but I do have an inordinate amount of trust that God steers, and through intuition, he puts me in the right places.
Guides you through it. So having had a read through it, so in one
Sorry
of the
that you did.
That's all right. Good preparation for today. And we've got some research interest around consumerism, which also fascinates me. So in one part of your thesis, you were looking at the writings of Aristotle and Aquinas on happiness. Let's see what you can remember about Aristotle and Aquinas and happiness. What's that left you with?
Oh gosh.
With regards to issues of Christianity and faith and engagement.
So maybe if I just backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
Through all of my thinking around issues of poverty and wider creation care, it very soon became very obvious to me that I could give my money to other charities, I could campaign and should campaign and call on governments and businesses to put in policies and practices that are good, but that actually I also had to take responsibility for my own life and recognise the way that my life was impacting other people through high resource consumption and not living carefully. And so all the way through my adult life, I've been trying to find ways of living in ways that take care of this world that God has made, and that does as little damage as possible and maybe even helps, and that thinks about how much resources I use, how much CO2 I emit, and tries to live in other ways. So I was doing that. I was already on the path doing that. And then at one point, after I'd left the EA and had more of a portfolio type life, I was contacted by someone who asked me to write, someone from HTB around Alpha, asked me to write a resource for them and with them around simplicity and simple living. I'd never not come across this term before, but as I did the reading for writing this resource, I realised that it encapsulated what I was trying to do. So this notion of simple living or simplicity, I realised was what other people called what I had been trying to do. So when it came to my thesis, I wanted to look at how do we live well as Christians, as followers of Jesus in a consumer culture? And does this idea of simplicity, does that notion have something to offer as an answer, by way of some sort of answer? When it comes to consumerism, a lot of consumerism is around the search for happiness, for perfection, for self-fulfillment. And Aristotle and Aquinas use this word eudaimonia, which can be translated as happiness, could also be translated as flourishing. And that seemed to capture the kind of word that consumerism is trying to seek after, and that we're all trying to seek after, that when it's in a healthy way. So then I wanted to explore, okay, how do they deal with that? Aristotle, but particularly Aquinas from a Christian perspective. So that then led me to thinking around how Aquinas approaches the virtues, and that actually we find fulfillment and flourishing and happiness by living a virtuous life, which for Aquinas, that sounds to us in our modern day of living a virtuous life sounds really boring and what have you. But for Aquinas, living a virtuous life is about the fullness of life, a rich living. And so that was the sort of thing that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, fascinating. So yes, eudaimonism, my PhD really focused on desire.
Okay.
Some agency. So why in particular evangelical imaginations have been co-opted through their worship practices.
Yeah.
So this issue of virtue, I didn't look at Aristotle at all, but you know, just discovering again. I was mostly interested in the epiphenomena, because I'm a pastor, a minister. How does this work in everyone's life day to day? And, you know, when it comes to virtue, finding that most people think, so virtue is, if I don't go to 55 clubs for my children, if we don't take 5 international holidays, if we don't, I have done some damage to them. They're disadvantaged in the globalized world. I haven't been a good parent. It's interesting what's underneath that drive to consume, to be a good parent. And that place, as soon as you start saying that, but this is what good parents do, don't they?
Yeah.
That's the place of virtue, isn't it? Wouldn't use the word virtue, but What have you found day to day in everyday life with Christians?
In terms of the parenting?
Yeah, just where virtue plays out, because people don't walk around using that word and they would think it was, you know, a bit sanctimonious and over spiritual. But, you know, we still, I guess, let me frame it this way. It's usually about good. What does it mean to be good?
Mm.
What's a good life? What's a good life for my kids? If you're going to relate in any shape or form to your family and community, that's what I found. That's where the rubber hits the road, and people make most of their decisions about what they're going to do and how they're going to spend their
certainly parenting is where the rubber hits the road. And actually, if I could bring it right down to the miniature, I found that it all coalesced, all came together in the lunchbox. What do I give my kids? I want it to be healthy, but I want it to be to be environmentally friendly, not to have harmed the planet. So something that might be healthy for them, like eating almonds, then actually isn't very good for the wider natural world. So I want it needs to hold those. I don't want it to be too weird, because I want them to feel a bit normal as well. So I want to put in the occasional frube or something that I might not normally do, because I don't want them to feel that they're standing out too much. And it all needs to happen on a budget, because at that point, certainly, I didn't have much money at all. So all of those things together, I found that lunchboxes was where it all came together. But if I can come back to Aristotle, I got there because as I was thinking around simplicity and listening to some of the research that I was doing around that, I began to see that there are real dangers in how we respond to consumerism. We can either jump in wholesale and become completely consumer focused in our lives and in our churches, or we can do a massive reaction where we go off into some enclave and don't relate to our culture at all. And we've got these extremes of loving the world too much, but also not loving the world enough. So we don't want to go into a Gnostic denial of material goods, whilst we also don't want to jump wholesale into complete hedonistic, narcissistic consumerism. And so there's this middle line, if you like, between poverty and riches. And I began to see that the path of simple living was about walking a middle line and holding these number of different tensions in balance. And Aristotle talks about the golden mean, the via media, that middle path, which then Aquinas picks up. So it was that concept that got me onto Aristotle and then onto Aquinas. And with the virtues, the ones that were key for me were holding together the virtues of temperance and justice. So temperance is what we might see reflected in moves to respond to consumerism by sort of seeing the negative trappings of consumerism in a busy life and too much possessions, and so it harms us. But if our response is only about that, then essentially it's consumeristic, it's still narcissistic. Whereas for Aquinas, he would say that temperance is only temperance when it's rooted in justice. And so my attempts around living more simply, yes, are partly because actually I get a better life when I'm not so focused on possessions and on money and on those sorts of things. But also that if it's only about that, then it's not Christian temperance. My simple living is rooted in a desire to live more simply so that others can simply live, and to be thinking about other issues of poverty and my impact on the wider natural world. So it was holding those virtues together particularly that were important for me.
And I noticed we both have read, because it's in our bibliographies, Vincent Miller's Consuming Religion. That was hugely influential.
About how we treat religion. And
the issue of commodification, so not consumerism so much, but how things are commodified in capitalism, and how disabling that is, that we might really stay with me some of his examples that you might get conceptually I want to shop well. But how do you? Because what commodification does is it strips production from place and locality and people.
Yeah.
And I always with, when I get to teach theology, I say, imagine if you went to a shop and every product was labelled with a traffic light system, not on the basis of fat, salt and sugar, but, you know, of the amount of suffering it took to produce this.
Yeah.
You know, shops wouldn't do that because you wouldn't buy it. Commodification deliberately rips things away so that you have no idea where this came from, or it takes a lot of work. And then it just becomes, as Miller says, exhausting. And everyone's exhausted with life anyway. So we default to this. I'd like to do something, but don't know how to.
Yeah, I think it was Stanley Hauerwas who described capitalism as amnesia, that we forget where things have come from. And really, I think I've spent quite a lot of the last decades. That's what I've been trying to tackle with people, trying to help and package it into simple ways to help people think through, where has this come from? Has it harmed anyone? Has it harmed the wider natural world? Trying to build awareness, help people understand the issues that are behind the products we buy and the way that we live.
Fascinating. Sorry, we spent ages talking about.
We could.
Couldn't we? So let's move on to Breathe, the virtual organisation.
Yes, so they were who I based my research on for my doctoral thesis. I wasn't that much a part of the network myself, though I spoke at their inaugural conference and was sort of associated and linked with them. But my main association with them was that they were who I used for the empirical research that I based my thesis on.
Yeah. Well, pulling out of your research, you've got there's an intersection of some key theological discourses. So you talk about the place of simplicity in the concern for global poverty, the recovery of an environmental theology, the rediscovery of the ancient paths of monasticism, and the tradition of Christian simplicity and radical dissent. And then this last one, ecclesiology and Christian formation in consumer society. Now, most of those are, people doing academic work might be familiar themes, but maybe the exception, the rediscovery of ancient paths of monasticism. I must admit, when I was looking through your work and I was like, yeah, okay, tick, 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 because we've read similar things. I was like, oh, monasticism. I was like, wow, how did that? Yeah, what was happening there? What was that? Just serendipitous? Was it a supervisor that led you to that? Was it your own intuitions and readings? How did that become integrated into?
I think it was a long time ago now, Jason, but I think it was my own intuitions and readings, as simple living sits quite naturally within the monastic tradition, though of course monasticism would take it to what they would describe it as poverty. And a little section of what I do is look at some of the different approaches to poverty within monasticism, or maybe not, but attitude towards possession. So that's quite different with a Franciscan approach or Benedictine approach, or some of the more modern versions or so on. But I think when you think about simplicity, let me try and rewind. Simplicity for me is about getting rid of the clutter that consumerism puts in our lives, that detracts us from focusing on relationships. And that is about our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, our relationship with the wider natural world, and our relationship with self. And I think that's very biblically rooted, and I could take you through all of that biblically, but I know we haven't got the time to do that. So if you think around consumerism, it acts in ways to detract you from those relationships. So then, I've now forgotten what the question was.
No, so is it, again, picking up from your research, so
monasticism.
A rule of faith
Yes.
simplifies life, but I'd never considered how a rule of faith simplifying life reduces your carbon footprint or makes you environmentally aware? Was that? I've never heard
Yeah,
that.
so if you think around all of those different things, building rhythm into your life for time for God, thinking about your relationships with other people, the wider natural world, all of that actually you see in the monastic tradition. And monasticism has often been a reaction to cultures that are in excess. So I'm not actually advocating monasticism, because I think we're better rooted right in our culture. But I think we have that's very simplistic, so I don't even want to be quoted with that. But we have a lot to learn from monasticism, and I'm not surprised that concepts of new monasticism have arisen again now, or over recent decades, as we're in such a turbulent time. And so people need to wanting to find their feet and their moorings and their rootings in something. And the monastic tradition offers that. So I think as we're thinking around how to respond to consumerism and to the challenges of our globalized world with poverty and environmental breakdown, there's a lot that naturally comes, because it's all integrated. This isn't just about taking a bag to the supermarket. This is about changing a whole reframing of life that lives differently in our culture. And there's a lot to learn from the monastic tradition as we seek to do that.
Yeah, it reminds me, again, my own research interests at the level of the habitual. So the idea of keystone habits, that you can have. Behavioral psychologists and neuroscientists know that you can have a keystone habit, a habit that unlocks that all your other habits get bundled up into. So like you say, don't just take renewable, usable carrier bags, but what's a larger order habit that transforms all your other habits. Is that the sort of thing that you were looking for in your work for community life?
Yes, yeah, and actually the PhD or the doctoral thesis became a book called Just Living, Faith and Community in an Age of Consumerism, which doesn't read like a PhD at all. It's been totally rewritten. And it finishes, the final third of the book is looking at habits and practices for today, linking in with some of those themes. So I'm in all of my thinking, I'm always wanting to be practical. For me, there always has to be a so what. I'm not interested in theology just for the sake of it. It's always got to answer the so what.
So I was about to mention your book, Just Living, that you distilled your research into something more accessible for non-academics. But that book starts with a family holiday on Bardsey Island off the coast of Wales.
Yeah.
Which seems to offer a sort of monastic retreat. There's no mains water or electricity or a supermarket. Can you talk again, unpack that a little for us about holidaying there influenced your doctoral thesis and your research?
Yeah, it's a wonderful place, just very small, 1.5 miles long and 1 mile wide. And it was originally a monastic community. So there are old ruins of an Augustinian I won't say convent, what's the word I'm looking for? You know what I mean? Monastery, that's the one. Yeah. And it's called the Island of 20 or 30,000 Saints or something. People wanted to be buried there and they thought it would help them through purgatory and what have you. So it has a beautiful heritage there. And it's now, in the Victorian times, it was a farming community. So now the farming houses, you can go and stay there. And so we just went there family holidays. We actually know the family who there's one family that lives on the island and farms it and helps take care of it. And we knew them. And one of the holidays, I was doing the research for my thesis and reading Aquinas and Aristotle. And it just chimed so well with being there on that island, isolated, away from everywhere. It has its own spiritual rhythm. So there's a little chapel there, and the people who live there, they do a morning prayer and a night prayer. So it just mixed in so well with what I was thinking about. And yet I'm only on Bardsey for 1 week a year. I mean, we don't go there anymore, but when we did. And the reality is the things that I'm thinking about and writing about have to be lived out, not on Bardsey, but back here on a council estate with a mortgage, with kids needing lunchboxes and going to clubs, and just the reality of normal life. And that is the challenge. And I think is what I've spent a lot of my adult life trying to help people think through, just based on my own attempts, as to how can we live well in normal life.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So Simon, our researcher, has also been looking at particular resistances to capitalism 100 years ago in the form of Christian socialism. So there's figures like the Reverend Vicar of Thaxted, Conrad Knoll, who trained at Chichester Theological College, and Knoll's views were greatly influenced by Karl Marx and also the art and crafts revivalist William Morris. Now, the critics of all of that broadly saw it as a sort of middle-class hobbyism with a romanticized medievalism. And again, it's an in-joke here with Simon, and you're from Sussex, you know, a slippery slope towards compulsory Morris dancing to make everybody live a more simple and better life. So, but even in Thaxted, farm wages were supplemented by second income earners from, you know, the town sweet factories and stuff. We've had a privilege of interviewing Eve Paul. I don't know if you come across Eve Paul, Third Church Estate Commissioner and a business consultant, and she's talked about problems of toxic capitalism. That's, you know, and a lot of the people that we're interviewing noticing those problems. But she, in talking with Eve, what surfaced in all of that, with all that background, is this sort of a disdain for business and money making that can emerge from those who are trying to respond to the pernicious aspects of capitalism, ends up in disdain. And you mentioned polarities here. I certainly, you know, found that some of the books that I read, just the level of life naivety, as if you could overnight with one of their theological theories replace the whole of global capitalism. It was just like, it was just crazy. It's just like, this is nonsense. This has got no traction in the real world. Which is why I liked people like Vincent Miller, who were like, how does the place of worship and agency and community, how does transformation take there instead of trying to overthrow capitalism? So anyway, so that leads me to need to come up with a question for you, which is this: after all the run up to it, what evidence is there that simple living by affluent Westerners lifts the global poor out of poverty, rather than industrialization controlled under non-corrupt and efficient democratic governments?
No evidence, because not enough of us have done it to know whether it has an impact or not, I would say. And like you have been saying, I am not against business or capitalism per se. And in fact, a lot of our work and the work that I support at Tearfund is geared around helping people into business and helping people have a livelihood and helping people be able to generate their own money and their own income. So when you look at it from a perspective of global poverty, being able to work and generate your own income is so important. And as you say, if we mustn't be naive and come from an overly wealthy perspective when we're looking at that. When it comes to lifting people out of poverty, export-led growth, I think, has been the most efficient way to do that. And over recent decades, that's what we've seen. The problem is if you are only focused on lifting people out of poverty immediately, and you're not taking in that wider nexus of relationships that I was talking about earlier around relationship with others and with God and with self and with the wider natural world. Because what we're seeing is that where we have seen rises out of poverty, that has come at the expense of the wider natural world, and it's not happening in a sustainable way, which means that ultimately it's going to push people back into poverty. So we are seeing now that the climate crisis is pushing people back into poverty who have been emerging out of it. So you might see immediate results, but it's not long term and it's not sustainable. And we have to find ways to level things. Not absolutely, but we do need to level to some extent. And we have to find ways to help people move out of poverty, but in a way that's sustainable and not in a way that follows our path then of completely trashing the wider natural world.
I hear you. So again, interject myself a little here. So growing up in public housing, council housing and everything else when I was a kid, if it wasn't for capitalism, I couldn't have gone to a bank and persuaded them to give me money and work a bunch of student jobs to put myself through a theology degree. Just managed to persuade them I could do that when I'd never had a loan. So I can see, I'm a beneficiary of a capitalist system that allowed me to be industrious and work towards something. But I also know at this stage of life, just those consumer pressures with friends and other people that you work and live with, and you go, why do we live like this? On the one hand, there is an industriousness that can create change and lift people out of challenging situations. But on the other hand, we get to a certain place where some of us, especially in the Western world, constantly choose lifestyles that are so deleterious to us and affect our souls and our psyches and our health. And we could live differently. So why don't we? How do you get let me turn it into a question. Where's the off switch for it?
Yeah. So let me just, one of the things I talk about in Just Living is some research that tracks levels of income with levels of well-being or happiness, coming back to that word. And up to a certain point, actually fairly low, I can't remember now what it is, they track together. But then past that, as levels of income rise, the levels of happiness and well-being don't keep up with it. So beyond a certain amount, and it will be different for people, beyond a certain amount, actually we don't need to keep growing and we don't need to keep getting more. There was another piece of research, very interesting, where people from all different economic backgrounds were asked, do they feel that they have enough? And the majority, pretty much everyone, said no. So then they were asked, how much do you think you would need in order to be able to say you have enough? And when they looked at the responses, wherever they were, wherever they started from, the figure that they gave was about 10% more than where they were. So it wasn't huge, people weren't being greedy and saying, I want, millions. It was just a little bit more, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more. And doesn't that speak to how, we're never quite content, are we? And I think one of the arts of living as a follower of Jesus in consumer culture is learning the discipline of gratitude, learning contentment. I think contentment and gratitude are really closely linked, so that instead of always looking up and saying, oh, I want more, I want more, I want more, let's look around and say thank you. I'm living in the same house that I've lived in for 26 years. When I've seen many of my peers move up to the next stage and get the bigger house and the other next thing, I love my house. So contentment and gratitude go really closely hand in hand.
Brings us wonderfully, we're almost at the end here, back to your mother and her joy of, look at this, look at they said, what a wonderful world. I mean, I'm speaking on Psalm 23 this Sunday, the first line, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing. And consumer culture is pernicious. It just, again, theologically, how we unpack it with, if there's fallen human nature, that just, there's not enough. Oh, just 10% more, just 10% more, just 10% more. And there's never enough. It's built on lack, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And I do think, thinking back, right back to some of the very earliest questions, that was instilled in me by my parents, that total gratitude for what we have. And they've always lived in a way that they live pretty simply. And then at the end of the year, they look at how, I mean, less so now they're retired, but they look at how much they've earned, how much they've spent, and then they would give all the rest of that away. And it would often be many thousands, and they'd allocate it and live simply through the year, but just more moderately, you know.
Yeah, moderately.
Not terribly.
Yeah. So yeah, we're on the home straight here. So want to move on from want to talk about your current role of global advocacy and influencing director at Tearfund. Now, we did interview Pete Meadows recently, and he was telling us that he stopped the Evangelical Alliance. Stopped the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund being called Earfund.
Yes, that's right.
Interesting. They put the T in front of it.
Yeah,
you can confirm that. Yeah.
I can only confirm that in that's it's a sort of well-known legend, but it's probably true.
It became Tearfund, and it started as a clearinghouse for humanitarian donations at the time of the Biafran crisis in Nigeria, and obviously Tearfund is enormous now. And Shepperton's down the road. There's usually always at least one person in my church. I'm up in Sutton, but there's someone at the minute works in the accounts department. There's always for 25 years. There's always been at least one person in my church who ends up, working for Tearfund. Yeah. So can you tell us a little about what Tearfund does now?
Yeah, so we work in around 50 countries, working in some of the poorest communities of the world, helping support people lift themselves out of poverty. And we do that very much through and with and alongside the church. So we're not an agency that will go in and build a school or give out mosquito nets or something. We do everything working through the church. So we have a model that we work through called Church and Community Transformation, which is a whole resource that motivates and trains and teaches the church, whether local churches or at a denominational network level, around the concept of integral mission and loving your neighbour, and then helps them to release the tools to be able to reach out to those that are around them. And we end up doing some amazing transformational things and really seeing the church realising its potential to be the church in the communities that they're in. We do, the times when we do just go in straight would be if there's a disaster or there's a humanitarian need. So we respond at a disaster and humanitarian level as well. But our longer term development work is done very much with the church. And then the other strand is the advocacy and campaigning work. So we recognise that if we're going to see, well, the big change is going to come through governments and businesses changing their policies and practices. And that's got to go hand in hand with the programmatic, the program work, the project work that we do on the ground. So we do a lot of the advocacy and campaigning side too.
Wonderful. Now we can land here on climate change. You said in the old days you had your environmental organisations and you had your aid and development organisations, and never the twain shall meet. Climate change has shown us that you can't keep those things separate. I mean, when you were talking about lifting people out of poverty, who are then being, because of environmental issues, pushed back into it, that these two things are not can't be separated anymore and aren't. So so what exactly is changing in that way with the strategic thinking of Tearfund and other NGOs?
Really realising that we have to put environmental features and particularly climate change right at the heart of all of our work. Not because we're becoming an environmental organisation, we're not, but because, as you said, they are absolutely entwined. So we hear every day of the impacts that climate change is having on the people and the communities that we serve. And as I look at country strategies being put together for our country work, you have to think about what are the environmental factors, what are the issues with, is it droughts or floods, hurricanes, typhoons, crops being destroyed. When we look at what causes hunger, you realise that actually it's the environment, it's an environmental crisis that is causing hunger and poverty. The other issue alongside that is conflict. And so as an organisation, we have 3 priorities. One is our approach through church and community transformation. The second is environmental and economic sustainability, so having that at the heart of everything we do. And then fragile states, so focusing on some of those, your Yemens and Syrias and Lebanons and so on, the real South Sudan, the real collapsing societies and they tend to have conflict at the heart of what is making them a fragile state. And often when you dig behind, you look at the conflict, there's all sorts of social reasons, but often those social reasons are being exacerbated by environmental pressures. So you just have to hold all of those things together.
Fascinating. My penultimate question, see if we can link climate change and COVID. So COVID has sparked a technological engagement, hasn't it, with Zoom and not traveling. And I'm finding actually post 19th of July, just a bunch of meetings I would have normally had in person still don't, even though we could, and just enjoying traveling. Carbon footprint, is lower, and I hope it will stay lower. And international air travel is lower. My son was a training air traffic controller, lost his job. Never thought they couldn't see that coming. We'll get back to it one day. But the jewel in the crown of industrial society today, probably, well, if it works, because we're still hoping it is going to work, is vaccination and the development of vaccinations. So my question is this: is scientific innovation, we talked about industrial business things and environmentalism, but what's the relationship between scientific innovation and climate activists? Are they working together? Does never the twain meet there, or what's happening in your world?
I think it's an uneasy relationship. People are nervous of the claim, oh, technology will sort it all out, because it hasn't done yet. It could do, but it only will do if there's the political will. So if you look at COVID, we have all the technological advances and we have the vaccines. That has happened because there's been the political will to respond to an emergency. We've had COVID-like things in other countries for years, Ebola happens elsewhere, but there isn't the political will amongst the more economically developed nations, and so nothing happens. So technology could provide the answer. In many ways, we have the answers, we have the solutions, but we don't have the political will to put them into place and to put us onto a different track. And there was a hope that the pandemic might do that. We are on an economic path to destruction. With climate change, you look at the floods in Western Europe, you look at the heat waves, the fires, etc. We are on an economic path to destruction. Getting off an economic path that you're on is really hard and causes huge social dislocation. But the pandemic has given us an opportunity to reset and to do something very different, and to use the economic recovery and the economic stimulus packages to place us on a different path that is more sustainable. And there was a real hope last year that might come through, where we're not seeing it now. And in fact, recent Tearfund research showed how much money the government has been spending on fossil fuels in comparison to to renewable energy, and there's a fair amount of research out there that studied the economic stimulus packages and is looking at where that money's going through. This could have been a huge opportunity to get us off the path to destruction. I'm not seeing that happen. I wish I could say something more positive.
Yeah, I suspected. Last question. I'd like to ask you what you're working on at the moment. And we've heard on the grapevine that you have written a children's book.
I have. Maybe I could just
have one prepared that you can show us.
Grab it. I have my books over here. I don't know if it's possible to mention any of my books at all.
Please do. See them as well. It was fun when people show us there.
Yes, Just Living that we've talked about quite a bit.
Yeah.
Then Saying Yes to Life was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book last year, but it doesn't have to be read as a Lent book, and it's an exploration of Genesis 1 and some biblical material, and I'm not selling it, but it's my favourite. It's my favourite book. It's so rich.
Excellent.
And then L is for Lifestyle, is really practical.
Yeah.
And then the latest one, Planet Protectors. 52 ways to look after God's world, that I've co-written with Paul Carenza, who's a comedian and BBC scriptwriter, and it's all illustrated and fun and so on. So really excited about that. There isn't another book in the Christian market that is really practical like that for children. So I hope it will be a real help for families. And then
getting ready for today, I saw Planet Protectors and thought, great, got to get our children's ministry into Planet.
Fab.
Love the title. It's great.
Good. Thank you. And then the other thing that I'm working on is a peer mentoring network for people around the world who have been, like I've been, trying to engage their churches, their denominations, their networks in wider creation care, which is making good traction now, good progress in the UK, but often elsewhere, again, people are just pushing water uphill. So putting together a network, bringing people together into small groups, into peer mentoring groups, so they can learn from each other and support one another. It's going to be called the Oikos Network.
Okay.
Oikos being, as you will know, the Greek from which we get both economy and ecology, bringing together those two things we've been talking about. So I'm quite excited about that too, putting my energies into that.
Well, Ruth, it's been a delight. Thank you for your time today and for opening up your life from when you were born through to today. It's very rich, and thank you for everything that you've shared. It's been really exciting today, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Bye, Ruth.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.